I would like to thank everyone for tuning into this podcast episode where we will be interviewing Vicky Bowman, whose current role as director of the Myanmar Centre for Responsible Business is the latest stage in an impressive career in diplomacy and the non-governmental sector. By way of general context, this podcast series will profile alums and members of the wider University of Chicago community by exploring how their compelling professional journeys intersect with wider cultural and societal developments and experiences. We are exceptionally fortunate to have Vicky here on multiple levels, as she can provide us with a wealth of insights drawn from her international career, as well as the fact that she had been incarcerated in Myanmar until relatively recently, and we are very thankful that she is able to participate in this podcast from the UK. In many ways, her international career began at the University of Chicago, as she did a scholarship year in Latin American Studies after completing her UK undergrad degree, and I will insist that we get amusing anecdotes about the college and Chicago in the late 80s. First, though, I'd like to focus on your professional and personal experiences in Myanmar, because it is a place that is interwoven throughout that journey in different ways, and also it is the focus of your current work. It has also defined the last year for you as a result of your imprisonment by the Myanmar government and then effective expulsion after your release. Since you clearly have a very deep relationship with Myanmar and are obviously committed to improving the economic circumstances of its people, to include staying in the country despite a coup and civil war, I would like you to walk us through the development of that relationship and how that has culminated in your current work. Your current role is as director of Myanmar Centre for Responsible Business, or MCRB. Could you please describe MCRB's mission and what role you believe it and the wider NGO ecosystem play in Myanmar?
Thank you. So the Myanmar Centre for Responsible Business was set up in 2013, so 10 years ago, and it was the brainwave of two think tanks. One of them, the Danish Institute for Human Rights, is a human rights commission for Denmark, and the other is called the Institute for Human Rights in Business. And it was at a time when the UN guiding principles on business and human rights were just being rolled out across the world. They'd just been agreed. And so the idea was that a centre would be created in Myanmar, which could make those happen in Myanmar, both from the perspective of making international businesses that were coming into the country for the first time after many years, and also the government, which was trying to get it on its feet in terms of democratizing, and then local companies who'd been having a rather traditional and not very corporate governance healthy way of doing business previously, to help them understand how they could do business responsibly, but then also help all of the civil society groups, the citizens of Myanmar who had expectations of that period. How could business best deliver on those expectations? So we were there to encourage responsible business conduct in Myanmar in the belief that was going to promote peace, democracy, sustainable development. And what we were very much trying to do was be a platform that brought together business, government, civil society groups. So I used to often be told by certain more activist local groups, we don't like you because you're in favour of business. And I would say, well, the clue is in the name. We are indeed the Myanmar Centre for responsible business. But the responsible bit is the important side of things. It's not that we're in favour of business full stop. It needs to be responsible. And so we were really trying to bring out practical lessons and share them amongst different businesses, both practical lessons from elsewhere in the world, but also from peer groups within Myanmar. And so through that, to ensure that businesses were kind of forewarned and could prepare to avoid, mitigate making the mistakes that others had made in the past. And then what we were also spending a lot of time doing was trying to improve the laws that existed, the new laws that were coming out, to make it easier for businesses to be responsible. Because obviously the worst thing is if a business wants to be responsible, but actually the law prevents them from doing so.
And I guess to sort of contextualize that moment, because and I think it's sort of, for those who are sort of less familiar with the history of Myanmar, this is the period that sort of obviously after the 2008 constitution, and then but before sort of the 2015 elections, which I think are sort of credited as being kind of the first genuinely open elections. And so was the sort of situating that within that time period, I mean, was this an agenda of the government in terms of a sort of an understanding that that was the direction of travel and to sort of prepare the economy for it? Or was it sort of a separate kind of growth initiative, which they would have sort of liked to have progressed with or without sort of the culmination of some of the democratic reforms that came later?
So it was very much supported by the then government, which was led by a former general, Thein Sein, who was heading up a government which was civilian, but definitely had been, in effect, put there by the military. The 2010 elections that brought them to power were not free and fair, but it was a government that was trying to show that there was a change, that Myanmar had moved on from the arguably 20 or even 50 years of isolation and military rule, and was trying to modernize. And one of the things they were keenest to do was ensure that they weren't dependent on, for example, Chinese investment, which had become almost the only foreign investment in the previous 10 years. So they really wanted to attract European, US, other investors, and they were both hearing, and they believed it themselves, that by showing they wanted responsible business and trying to understand what that meant in practice, that was going to bring in a diversity of investors, and that would be good for the country.
And was the view of both sort of the government, to the extent that you can have visibility of that, what was the view of the government and then those in both the private sector and in sort of the NGO sector looking to kind of liberalize some of the economic sectors and the underlying laws? Because of that isolation, was it a case study model where you kind of looked at other countries which had gone through a similar experience, or had there been industries already which had been already experiencing some degree of foreign investment, and that was sort of what would then be built upon?
So really the only significant sector that had foreign investment prior to that was the oil and gas sector, and in particular Total of France was a major investor and Chevron was a partner within that. And that had been investment that had come in 1989-90, which was the last time that had been an opening up. But in those days, it was under the military regime. And then there was a kind of contraction during the Asian financial crisis and because of a hardening in the approach taken by the military. So coming in around 2012, which was at the point at which people started to really look at Myanmar as being on a transition journey, there you had the remnants of an attempt a few decades previously of a garment sector. You had these oil and gas investments, but you didn't have any significant financial services. You didn't have modern transport, logistics, manufacturing more generally. Agriculture was very much at a kind of the lowest end of the value chain. There was no added value. So there was a lot to build on, and there was a legal framework which a lot of it dated back to colonial times. So the companies law, for example, was from 1913, as far as I remember. And so one of the big tasks there was to modernize this, but not to modernize it to the point that Myanmar simply couldn't cope in terms of implementation. The companies law was a case in point that it was modernized, and many people said that the technical assistance that was given by the World Bank, which was using effectively the Australian companies law as a model, was just going to be too much for the system. It was too complicated. Actually, I think in practice, it's work. It's still being rolled out, and even post-coup, it's in place. It's being pursued. So there was a need to pick the right models, not to go for Sweden, not to sort of aim too high. But at the same time, there was a huge appetite for reform. So long as one could overcome the fact that there was just a basic lack of capacity in government, and that was English language capacity, legal understanding. I mean, for example, every department, every ministry, very few of them had lawyers. The lawyers were all bunched together in the Attorney General's office. The mining ministry had one lawyer. So these kind of things made it quite difficult to do regulatory reform after 3 or 4 decades where laws had been written by generals, really, or not been written at all.
And you mentioned that there had been some liberalization early 1990s. Was that in response to the 1988 sort of student uprising?
So yes, the 1988 uprising was the end of the Ne Win period. Ne Win was the dictator who came from a military background and who took power in 1962. And that military rule lasted until 1988 when he suddenly stepped down. This then generated an election in 1990, which produced the National League for Democracy, led by Aung San Suu Kyi, as the big winner. But because the generals were sort of caught by surprise by that, they never allowed that election to be put into place, or rather the results to be put into place. And so instead we had continued military rule. But at the same time, they were trying to do economic liberalization, what they called open door. So that was moving from socialism to a form of capitalism, of liberalization. But really that declined after the 1997 Asian financial crisis, and a sort of combination of both the external factors, the exit of a lot of foreign investment that had come in at that time, but also a tightening of economic opportunities, which were then being carved out for a smaller and smaller number of people. All of that meant that in 2010, 2012, the economy was in a pretty unhealthy state. And that was probably also one of the things that drove the decision of the generals to open up and to have new elections.
And I'm sure we'll touch on this dynamic throughout the course of this conversation. But in terms of assessing kind of the sort of the landscape of the government, what strikes me about that description is that even within sort of what seem to be fairly narrow parameters of kind of economic liberalization, there was a sort of a back and forth, and there was sort of fits and starts. And was that reflective of different, for want of a better term, sort of factions in the government? So obviously you had in other sort of kind of single party systems, if you think about sort of China, you sort of the evolution from Mao to Deng, and then obviously in the Soviet context, you had different perspectives on the degree for economic liberalization. Is it fair to say that those similar tensions and ebbs and flows throughout the military period?
I think the first point is that the military have very little training or understanding of the economy. That was true then, it's true now. It's not part, obviously, of military training more generally. And although I would occasionally meet people in the military who at the colonel level had gone through a master's, and one of them told me he'd written a dissertation on whether or not Yangon should have a stock market. And I asked him, should it? And I could see that somebody else had written his dissertation by the fear in his eyes. But I don't think that there was a lot of understanding, and the education and experience that these people had entirely been acquired within Myanmar during a socialist period. So that was sort of underlying understandings of business. On top of that, you've got to look at Myanmar's history, the colonial history, the perception that outsiders are coming in to rob and pillage the country. And that is still very much a part of the kind of the history books, the curriculum, whether it be in schools or in the military colleges. So there's always going to be a suspicion about foreign investment, and that's not unique to Myanmar, frankly. And then just straightforward knowledge. So very few of the military leadership and their sort of successor government that took power had studied abroad, had travelled abroad. So a lot of the concepts that were suddenly being exposed to were a big challenge for them. So I'm not sure if it was an ebb and flow so much as just there was a desire to learn, but you were starting from a very low base, whether we were talking here about civilian civil servant or the people in the ministerial leadership. But there was a desire to learn. There was a desire to change. I think that was the most strong sense I got, that there was a real desire for reform in that government that was taking power between 2011 and 2016.
Yeah, I mean, it's very interesting. And this is this foreshadows, I think, sort of some of the, the sadder elements of the current chapter, in that, yes, there had been military rule for multiple decades, but it does seem, and this is obviously from an outsider's perspective, but it does seem as though the military was indeed trying to sort of set a pathway for sort of some degree of democratic openness, and doing it in a way that still sort of essentially protected them from, I guess, sort of reprisals for the excesses of the military period. There seems to be sort of a genuine belief within the military that although it probably needs to be managed on some level by sort of a military counterbalance, that you do need to sort of unleash kind of economic dynamism. And it does seem as though they were going about that from their perspective deliberatively.
I also think that a strong economy is something that supports strong security, a strong military. The healthier the budget is, the better funded the military can be, as one sees if you look at the US, for example. So the military understood that having a strong economy was going to be helpful. And frankly, they were also benefiting, or perhaps more to the point, their children were benefiting. I mean, any of them who had, for one reason or another, managed to get an education or had sufficient resources that they could invest, they were doing well out of setting up small companies, renting their houses out to the newly incoming expatriates and so on. So there was a general common interest in seeing reform and seeing change. And during that period, it was actually one of the more open periods from the perspective of civil society groups, because the government of the time, Thein Sein's government, was very keen to sign up to international initiatives such as the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative. They wanted to sign up to Open Contracting Initiative, although at that point civil society groups said no, one at a time, show that you can do the EITI first. But they were very keen to join in with many of these things which they had previously been either self-excluding themselves from or excluded by the rest of the world from joining. It was a positive time for civil society. At the The NGOs registration law was relaxed to make it easier to be a civil society group. And yeah, there was a lot going on.
Yeah, it obviously must have been an absolutely fascinating time period to be sort of looking at those issues, because it does seem as though sort of you're sort of at the beginning stages of what was sort of a promising chapter, and where there was a lot of momentum, both with the government and obviously sort of private sector and other stakeholders. And obviously there's sort of a whole range of what you do currently that's really interesting. But one of the things that I find really interesting is that your work is an important attempt to reconcile the tensions between the values of international economic engagement and human rights, as sort of we touched upon, in that there's sort of manifold benefits to economic investment, but it is also something which can lead to direct abuse, in that it could be funneled into industries that are engaged in abusive practices, and it could also be a mechanism of sort of entrenching anti sort of democratic forces. But what I like about it is it seems as though you attempt to provide an analytic framework for responsible investment. And I mean, would you agree with that? And sort of, is that something that's sort of front of mind both for your organization, and was that front of mind for those who were grappling with these issues during this time period? And I guess the human rights, or sort of the consideration of values, probably goes in both directions, as you alluded to. One is making sure that so the government or other actors aren't sort of abusing the circumstances of the investment, but then also that the companies that are coming in are investing in a way that is mindful of the longer term needs of the local population.
So first up, whatever we did, we based it in international legal frameworks, international norms. So the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, but also things like the IFC performance standards of the World Bank, which are the guidelines around issues like health and safety, biodiversity, and so on, that they apply to their own investments in developing countries. So those were always our reference points for making recommendations, whether it was to government or business. The second, perhaps most important point, is to avoid that tension. That's where you need good governance. That's where you need good regulatory frameworks. And you also, perhaps above all, need good government policies and planning. And where you tend to see these issues of that tension and abuses playing out on the ground, for example, in extractives industries who are engaged in deforestation or pollution, is because you've not had a good government approach from the beginning around things like spatial planning. And this was unfortunately where I think there was a big weakness in Myanmar, and still is, and one that we were at the time of the coup subsequently trying to address in the next government that was coming in. Because I would, for example, go into the mining ministry office in northern Myanmar in Kachin state and see their map of where all of the mines that they either had or were planning to give licenses for. And I'd go an hour later into the forestry department and see all the protected areas. And I would take a picture of those two maps and overlay them. And it was quite clear there was a complete conflict between what one ministry was trying to do and what the other was trying to do. And licenses were being handed out in fragile areas of biodiversity, areas where it was going to impact on the water resources and so on, and also where there were indigenous people, ethnic minorities, who had legitimate demands around decision making and also around the resources and benefits they should receive if there were to be investment agreed by them in those areas, what we call free, prior and informed consent. In other words, they should have the ability to say whether or not they wanted that investment, but also potential part of that decision would be how were they going to benefit, whether it was through income coming to them that could be used for local development, jobs, respect for certain culturally sensitive sites, that kind of thing. So none of that was in place at all. And so instead, what you were seeing was in this keenness to invite investment and to sort of show numbers going up of investors, of licenses and so on, a lot of that was just being forgotten. And then down the track, there would be the problems that would come up, where suddenly a local community would discover that there was going to be a coal mine in their backyard and they'd never been consulted on it. So we did a lot of work on developing what we call a sector-wide impact assessment. So usually when a company is investing, they're simply looking at their own project and they're looking at it within the existing legal framework, which might require them to do an environmental and social impact assessment, but they can't really change the laws that are in place. However, we said, no, you've got to step back and look at it from a bigger picture. are the laws themselves flawed? Are they not consistent with one another? And so that was what we did in the oil and gas sector, the mining sector, tourism, and the ICT sector, which was facing a huge explosion of people going online, getting mobile phones, and so on, to point out these are the gaps or these are the problems in the entire legislative framework. And this is how we recommend that you could fix those, drawing on good international practice.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the relationship with international investment and negotiating all those sort of competing interests and considerations demands sort of a nuanced understanding of the various sectors and how they all interact. And I think what's interesting is that a lot of your work, I think I have the timelines on this correct, the MCRB and your involvement with it then obviously saw sort of the transition to a slightly less optimistic period where the international community was identifying issues with Myanmar. I mean, specifically, obviously, the events in Rakhine and with the Rohingya, and which I think raises the interesting question of sort of sanctions. And I think sort of sanctions in some respects are an interesting contrast. Some of the elements of what the NGO sectors and all that do, and that it's a very sort of, it can be quite a crude instrument. And how do you think about reconciling the need to have deterrence for certain behavior, I guess from your on the ground perspective, deterrence for certain kind of behavior, and then sort of the unintended consequences of it for an economy or a country that is trying in some respect in good faith to grapple with the possibilities of that economic development?
So if you're looking at this from the point of view of investors, while there may be some who take advantage of a crisis to go carpetbagging, by and large, investors, when they see something happening like the Rohingya crisis in northern Rakhine state, where hundreds of thousands of Rohingya were pushed out to Bangladesh, and also obviously the coup in February 2021, the risk profile for the country shoots way up. And generally that leads companies to say, right, okay, let's put our investments on hold. We won't expand. We will see whether we can continue to do what we're already in there doing. It's not realistic to expect companies to go to governments and say, you're doing naughty things there and naughty things there. But they can at least pass that message that what you have done has made this country not a attractive investable proposition anymore. And particularly then when a government takes steps to do things which are directly impacting on business, whether it be expropriation, which is not something that we've seen in Myanmar, or when it's things like clamping down on freedom of association so that trade unions are no longer able to function, people are getting arrested. Those are the kind of messages which my centre encourages businesses to give to those in power, to say, again, this is going to be really bad for business, for our ability to stay here responsibly, and therefore for jobs and the economy. So that's where businesses, I think, can play a role. Now, if the rule of law totally collapses, if you simply cannot operate in the country without paying bribes, and therefore you're in breach of your international legal obligations, that's the point at which you as a business have to say, okay, we cut our ties, because then you can't be legally compliant with your home state. It's in that kind of interim between, okay, it's not that bad, but everybody is looking at this country and saying, gosh, that's a really bad place. What role should business play? And there I think that it's always important for businesses to look at the impacts of different options. If we stay, what are the potential adverse impacts of our doing business here? How can we reduce them? If we go, what are the adverse impacts of that going to be? So there needs to be that impact assessment and then that communication of your conclusions. Why do you think that it is actually better for the country and for the people for you to stay, for you to continue to source your garments? Or why is it better to go? Often the decision to leave and the consequences of leaving can throw up some quite negative outcomes, particularly if you're a business that's been making money. So if you have a license for telecoms, for breweries and so on, those are pretty valuable. And if you pull out, then some bad players can potentially sort of circle and grab that, and you have the opposite of the effect you were trying to achieve. You're not helping good governance and democracy in the country. You're actually bolstering the bad players. And I think we're seeing that a lot in Russia, where companies who are being encouraged to leave by the reputational pressure on them from the West and from their kind of home constituencies and stakeholders are finding that their businesses are falling into the hands of Putin's cronies.
And it's very interesting. And obviously, we've obviously had sanctions for different countries have imposed sanctions in different contexts. But I mean, I think clearly the Russia sanctions. You've had it with Iran and Cuba and all that. But I think the Russia sanctions are a sort of the latest stage of that. And I do think that it's it's clearly a complex issue because they do have a negative effect on a regime that is doing things that the international community disagrees with, to put it mildly. But then on the other hand, on some level, it always seems as though sort of the wrong people step into the void. And so there's sort of that tension. Obviously, I think it's probably fair to say, and we'll get into some of sort of your sort of recent personal circumstances a little bit later, but I think it's fair to say that it's probably the most difficult now running the MCRB. And how are you as an organization sort of thinking about this moment, and what are some of the work you're doing in what is, sort of clearly, I think, probably the most challenging time period for decades to be doing these sorts of things, and where the economy is probably, I would imagine, its most challenged in a very long while?
So I'm now based back in London, and as you alluded to, I was incarcerated for 3 months in 2022, after which we decided to formally close our office in Yangon. Now, that sadly meant that our small team of Myanmar staff was made redundant, but at least they have many of the skills working around responsible business that allows them to pick up ad hoc consultancy on different issues. For me, I'm working part-time remotely. Now, it's definitely suboptimal. I would like to be in the country. I would like to feel the atmosphere in the country, pretty awful as it is, because I think it's really important that people who work on Myanmar are living inside the country rather than doing it from across the border in Thailand or further afield. So I feel bad from that perspective. On the other hand, COVID has taught us all that, remote working and dialing in and having meetings online has become a norm. So a lot of the work that I'm doing at the moment is focused on things like the garment sector, where this is a major provider of jobs in Myanmar. At its peak, it was 700,000 plus, and it was growing. And there is a debate now as to whether or not it is possible to source garments, bags, shoes responsibly from Myanmar. I believe it is, providing you have people on the ground and providing you are very alert to all the different risks. And what I've found also is that there are very different models within the garment sector in terms of the way that companies are either totally on top of what their supplier facilities, the factories in Myanmar are doing, or very much at arm's length. And obviously those arm's length relationships make it less and less likely that if there's a problem in the factory, the brand is going to be able to A, be aware of it, and B, actually step in to address it. So these are the kind of issues I'm working on now remotely, but together with others who are inside the country, including the European Chamber of Commerce and some of the others in that sector. And then more broadly, again, mostly with multinationals, but to some extent with Myanmar companies, acting as a sounding board for different issues which pop up. So one of the things that we worked on just before the coup and finalised a report on was around private security companies. So I'm not talking here of the Wagners of this world, but much more of the security companies that you have in your garment factory, in your shopping centre, at your bank. We were looking at human rights of that sector, both of the workers themselves, who are probably, the guards are probably the ones who have their human rights abused most in terms of working conditions in some of these companies, but also the ability of guards to impact negatively on the human rights of others, whether it be customers or local communities. Now, what we saw after the coup were completely new scenarios that we hadn't really been expecting, such as what do you do if you are guards in a shopping centre where you have occasional kind of flash mob demonstrations by anti-military protesters? How do you manage that safely, both from the perspective of the protesters and freedom of expression, but also the wider customer clientele? And there's a particularly notorious case that happened in October 2021, about 6 months after the coup, where a small demonstration in a shopping centre led to one of the mid-ranking guards yelling to his team, "Catch them." Now, this was all filmed, uploaded on social media, and it led to a boycott of that shopping centre, which lasted about 6 months and meant that they also lost a lot of office tenants in their office tower. So it really hit their bottom line that they hadn't planned and managed for that case, or they told me, in fact, they had a whole protocol about quietly escorting them out the back door before soldiers might arrive. But anyway, it didn't work that day. So those kind of examples that have come up are very important learning for other companies to ensure that they don't fall into the same trap. And these are the kind of things that we've been bringing to people's attention post-coup as part of what they need to do is what's called heightened due diligence in a country that's affected by conflict.
Absolutely fascinating. And obviously, and we'll get into it in a little bit more detail sort of later, but obviously the circumstances are, as you say, suboptimal to put it mildly, but all that work sounds absolutely fascinating. And so now that I think we have a better understanding of your current work, it'd be very interesting to learn more about how you got here. Is it correct that your first professional work in Myanmar was with the British Embassy in 1990? Was that the first time you'd been in the country? And just generally kind of what were your first impressions? And yeah, if you could sort of paint a picture of what life was like in Myanmar when you first arrived, I think that'd be absolutely fascinating.
Sure. So I joined the Foreign Office, the British Foreign Office, after leaving Chicago. I'd actually got my job in the Foreign Office and then deferred it when I received the scholarship to go to UFC. And in fact, the day I joined, there was the military coup in Myanmar, 18th of September, 1988. And somehow that, I think, has shaped my career, because that year we were invited to make bids for our first posting, and if we wanted to learn a hard language. So I opted to learn Burmese and was trained for about 6 months before going out there in 1990. So in that position, you get intensive language training, and then the expectation is that you'll go back at least once in your career. I had no knowledge of Burma other than I'd had an ex-boyfriend who he and his father had taken spare parts from a Scottish lighthouse out to an exact same replica colonial era lighthouse in Myanmar, and he'd showed me some pictures a few years ago, and it all looked quite nice. And so when Burmese came up on the list of languages to learn, I said, I'll take that one if I can have it. So I arrived in Myanmar about a month after they'd had elections, 2 months after the elections in 1990, and it was still a country which was coming out of its isolation. We were under the first 2 years of military rule that had started in 1988, but the expectation then was that the election result was going to lead to a change. But it was rapidly becoming clear at the time I was there in July 1990 that the military were not willing to hand over power to Aung San Suu Kyi's party. It felt like it was a step back in time. If you fly through Bangkok or through Singapore or Hong Kong, high-rise buildings and so on, none of that within Myanmar. This was a low-rise city, even Rangoon, which was the most developed area. In Mandalay, which is now a very bustling hub, I was able to sort of ride around on a bicycle being chased by military intelligence as I did a couple of months of language immersion up there to try to bring my conversational skills up to scratch. So military intelligence everywhere, and those could lead to some sort of amusing exchanges with soldiers. There was a train I took to Mandalay to go up there for the first time, where I had booked the 2-berth cabin, and a military captain came in and told me that he was going to sleep in the other one. And I said, actually, I've paid for both. But he said, well, I want to talk to you. So he sat there chatting to me. And even those very sort of basic conversations where he would say things like, I would never salute Aung San Suu Kyi or her husband, you get a sense of how the military are trained. And then suddenly the door opened and his friends from the next door carriage, also military, sort of came in saying, you've got to stop talking to her, you'll get into trouble talking to this foreigner. At which point he whipped out his pistol and sort of shook it at them and said, piss off, having a nice conversation with this lady. So those kind of things stick with you as being very unlike what you're used to in Chicago or London or Cambridge or wherever. And fascinating insights into a country that was expecting to be on the point of change, but that change actually didn't really happen for another 10, 20 years until we had the real transition in 2012, at which point, it's still nowhere near what its peers are in the rest of Asia in terms of development. But now everybody is online. That was a massive change. Whereas back in 1990, you were lucky if you could make a phone call. And if you did, you had to sort of yell into it while the sound of either a broken line or people listening in could be heard in the background. So a very different time.
And could you describe in some detail the work you did during your two? So I believe you had two diplomatic postings. One was, sort of, as you said, kind of just shortly after being at U Chicago, and then sort of about a decade later. And sort of, what were some of the projects you worked on? And sort of just in general, what is the role of a Western/European diplomat in that particular context where you've obviously got sort of a government that is oppositional in terms of values with the government that you're representing?
So in my first posting, I was the second secretary doing just about everything. I mean, it was meant to be kind of political affairs, but we had such a small embassy that I was doing economic, commercial, occasionally also doing visas. And it was at a time where we weren't talking to the government. So it was pretty much immediately after the coup and the elections. So there was very little interaction with government. There wasn't much in the way of an international community because the aid development was suspended both by the UK and others. And mainly my interaction was with local people my age who had not been either arrested or gone into the jungle. And there weren't very many of them. Most of the people my age, I was in my early 20s, had done one or the other. And so in order to sort of build connections with them, which they could then explain, should the military intelligence say, why are you talking to that foreigner? One of the things I dived into was translating short stories and poetry and getting to know the literary and artistic world such as it was. And also trying to travel. But again, the areas one could travel were pretty restricted at the time, but we could get up into a few places. So my main focus was generally around human rights, particularly around political prisoners, around the risks that people were facing of arrest. I was advising people back in the Home Office in London about asylum applications that were being made and whether the claims were likely to be genuine, those kind of things. Coming back again in 2002 as ambassador, there was slightly more engagement with the government. It was still the military government, but we were engaging on HIV/AIDS because the perception was that if we stood back from that, it would become a massive explosion that would hit whoever, or hit the people basically under whichever regime that they were. And there seemed to be some openings with the military government, particularly the Minister of Health, who was a professional doctor, that suggested that we could work on this issue, including, for example, supporting NGOs who were working on support for condom distribution, support for needle exchange and programs and that kind of thing. So there was an element of working on local development and particularly on health, also on a little bit on environmental conservation, but it was still a very limited time. Again, I built relationships with the artistic community, and in the end ended up marrying one of them. So my husband Tain Lin was somebody who, indeed, as my age, he had been in the jungle in India at the time I was first in the embassy. He'd been in jail subsequently, but he'd been released and was released in 2004, halfway through my diplomatic posting. And I met him about 3 months later in association with an exhibition that he did. So those were the kind of things I did to keep busy during that time. But it was an odd posting. And there were times when I was both by the military accused of going to the NLD headquarters and giving them instructions, and being accused by my UK Parliament of not going to the NLD headquarters enough. So what I tended to do in those situations was send them the military-run newspaper with all the expose of how many times I'd been and ask for it to be put in the House of Commons library.
Absolutely fascinating. And I think sort of clearly kind of your career has sort of run the gamut in terms of, Myanmar specifically, because you've obviously had your diplomatic postings, you've had, and then obviously your current work. And then another element to your career, which I think is really interesting, is that you worked in an external affairs capacity for the global mining company Rio Tinto. And just basically, I don't know whether that specifically had a Myanmar connection, but I think it's just sort of, it must have been a fascinating experience just generally. What did you learn from that private sector experience? And I guess sort of it's not a controversial thing to say that a company like Rio Tinto, in terms of the countries where it operates and the sectors it's involved in, does obviously rub up against some of the environmental and sort of labor and human rights concerns that your work is focused on. So yeah, basically sort of how did you find that the company internalized or didn't internalize those values, and what was your sort of role in shaping that?
So it's a fairly well-worn track from diplomacy to the extractive industry, both oil and gas and mining. I think because the impact that oil and gas and mining companies have on the countries where they're invested in can be hugely significant for the political economy of those countries. So the skill set that you need in a mining company to understand that and to manage those impacts and manage those relationships, both with the government, the regulator, but also with other stakeholders, is quite similar to diplomacy. For Rio Tinto, there was a kind of residual Myanmar connection in that Rio had bought Ivanhoe, which was a Canadian mining company who were very active in Mongolia. And along the way, they'd acquired and then exited from a copper mine in Myanmar. This was very much at arm's length, and I wasn't involved in it at all, except sort of viewing it from afar. But my job in Rio was around these sort of big global issues related to mining's impact on development, such as the resource curse, resource nationalism, as a mining company would see it. In other words, where countries were either preventing their resources from being extracted or expropriating them when they were, those kind of risks, or upping the taxes suddenly on a unilateral basis. Transparency, which was very much a development through from the sort of 2000s onwards with the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, which Rio Tinto was a significant player in, and then also human rights. And so the 2011 UN Guiding Principles had just come into agreement. So I was in charge of adopting Rio's first standalone human rights policy, developing that, but then also meshing that into what Rio had already been doing in different mines around the world, Madagascar, Australia, Canada, Mongolia, and so on, and working out how those commitments at a global level actually played out in practice on the ground. So, for example, you get these dilemmas like, as a mining company in Guinea, you're trying to build a railway line, and some of the railway alignment is going to go past sort of sites which are used for female circumcision. Now, I think we would all agree that female circumcision is an abuse of women's rights, but this is a cultural practice. So therefore, if you're destroying those cultural sites, are you abusing cultural rights? So these are the kind of issues that we would, have discussions around with the teams involved, with the miners involved. So those are the kind of things that we were dealing with. I think a company like Rio, it has its ups and downs in terms of its both internal practices and external reputation as a responsible miner. I was happy that I think I was in a time when we were on the up, but we've had some bumps since then, including the Juukan Gorge in Australia, where a Aboriginal site was destroyed by explosives for an iron ore mine.
And I guess just synthesize it a bit. So your brief effectively is to how much of it is sort of an absorption and application, namely sort of these are the kind of global standards, these are the regulatory requirements, and sort of shaping the internal response to those, and how much of it is a sort of an advocacy position where you go to either national governments or those international organizations and say, these are the unintended consequences of this particular piece of legislation, or as you say, like some of the values that you're seeking to uphold here will have negative consequences in this particular scenario on these other set of values, and you gave the example of sort of the tension between sort of cultural preservation when perhaps some of those cultural practices might have sort of rub up against Western sensibilities.
So when you're in a global role like I was, your interfaces are with people like the World Bank and the IFC, UN agencies, who, particularly in the case of, for example, the UN Development Programme and so on, they recognise the importance of the private sector, but they're always a bit wary about engaging with it. I was the kind of the friendly face insofar as, coming from a diplomacy background, I could at least therefore understand what their concerns and sensitivities were. You're also playing a role within industry bodies at global level. So for the mining sector, you have people like the International Council of Mining and Minerals, which is a company association, but one which is trying to lift practices for the industry, because the mining industry in particular is always concerned that the action of a few bad apples drags the sector down. So it has an interest in improving practices across the sector, including kind of helping its competitors to be better, so that it in turn doesn't suffer. And then you're also a player within multi-stakeholder initiatives where you've got government and civil society groups and mining companies. So, for example, the Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative, the voluntary principles on security and human rights. But in all of that, you've got to stay in touch with the actual mine sites, the country managers, the people who are doing community engagement on the ground in your diamond exploration site in India or in the mineral sands in Madagascar, to be able to both bring stories from the field like that, but also bring back the commitments and policies that Rio is committing to at global level and ensure that they are playing out properly in those countries on the ground. What I've noticed, not just in Rio, but actually in my subsequent work, is there were times when I would, for example, talk to a company in Myanmar and say, oh, but your company is signed up to this. And the country manager would look blankly at me and would have never have heard of it. And I think this is a problem that multinationals have, that they may sign up at the top level, but they don't then communicate that. The country manager, who's too busy focusing on hitting his revenue targets, doesn't actually pay attention to the whatever newsletter comes around from the centre. So there's got to be that constant dialogue with teams on the ground and bringing them up to date, and also enabling them to sort of share lessons across from one mine in Madagascar to another in Peru, where there may be similarities that they can learn from one another.
Yeah, well, it sounds as though it's a sort of a fascinating multidisciplinary role, in that you're looking at kind of the high level sort of legislation, policies, and then sort of very high level interface, but then sort of operationalizing that by getting sort of your hands involved in the different jurisdictions, and then the different application of sort of the practices on the ground, which I think uncontroversially, it would be fair to say, sort of present challenges from in terms of the countries and it as a sort of a general business sector. All that's been really, really interesting to learn about. And hopefully we've given our listeners a good understanding of your wider career and how it has intersected and been shaped by your experiences in Myanmar. Obviously, this last chapter has been very dramatic for you, as it featured your imprisonment, ultimate release, and now remote management of MCRB. Basically, yeah, so sort of, could you describe kind of the circumstances of how that happened? And I imagine it obviously sort of comes in the context of the coup and civil war. Yeah, it just basically sort of, what were the circumstances that sort of led to that?
Both through COVID and then after the coup in February 2021, I decided I wanted to stay inside Myanmar. A number of expatriates left, both circumstances, but I felt that there was a high risk that if I left, it would be very difficult to return, and I didn't feel that I could either manage my team or do the work effectively if I was stuck outside the country. Plus, there was the question of my family, my husband being Myanmar, my daughter being at school there. So we stayed in the country. It clearly, the military regime taking over meant that it was impossible to work with government on regulation in the way that we previously had. It also meant that many of our civil society partners were no longer able to participate in well, we didn't have events because in many cases they were getting jailed or they had gone away to the jungle or gone overseas. So our focus was largely on companies, both the ones who were staying inside and the ones who were trying to decide whether to stay or go. But we were nonetheless still operating in that way, working with the chambers of commerce and others. However, I think that the military regime had a completely different idea of what I was doing. And this started to become clear in about a year ago, in mid-2022, when there were often people turning up either at our office in Yangon or at my house up in the hills, our family house, or talking to people in the neighborhood. And it was a bit like the Lord of the Rings, the Black Riders. It was sort of, where is Bowman? What does she do? So at that point, it became quite clear that the regime had, I think, the wrong idea about me. And I started to suspect that they wouldn't extend my visa, which was coming up for renewal in October. So I was already planning what were we going to do as a family because of that. However, it was the 24th of August, and I was, as one always is in these cases, on a Zoom call. And there was this, back in Yangon, and there was a sudden knock on the door, very loud knock. And I and my husband were both at home. My daughter hadn't yet come back from school. And outside there was about 10 people, including a big fat police captain looking rather nervous, and a couple of guys with guns and various hangers-on. And so they said, could I come with them for inquiries? Both of us, both myself and my husband. So we did, and we went to the police station. Now, what they charged me with was failing to fill in a permanent change of address form, which I said I was not guilty of because I hadn't permanently changed my address, although we'd been staying up in the hills to avoid the coup and COVID. We'd been coming backwards and forwards to the flat in Yangon, which is what my permanent address was registered at. But it became clear due to their briefing, I didn't know this because by this time I was already arrested and therefore couldn't have any contact with any sort of digital media. But they were briefing to say that I had set up a different organization called Justice for Myanmar, which was a very different nature. It was much more kind of investigative journalism, naming and shaming, those kind of things. So this was an anonymous organization. So clearly they had been racking their brains as to who these people were who were exposing their business dealings. And somebody had said, it's that Vicky Bowman. So that was what it was largely about. However, I was charged with having failed to send in a change of address form. So I was sentenced to a year, together with my husband, who had 2 years concurrently for failing to have told me to send in my change of address form as a foreigner. And then we were put into insane jail, which for him was his second time in there. He'd been jailed for 6.5 years previously. So it was fascinating because for me, it taught me a lot about, or I could actually get to see all of these things that I'd always heard from both him, but many other friends who'd been in jail. So I got to see it in reality. And also I got to meet both old friends. I mean, a number of people who went, "Oh, hey, Vicky, what are you doing in here?" You don't see that many people in jail because you're usually incarcerated in your own cell block. But whenever I was out, there always seemed to be somebody there who knew me and who I was sort of surprised to see, and they were surprised too. So it was very interesting for 3 months. And it was also actually an interesting or an opportunity to digitally detox and to exercise more and to read some books. We got some access to TV, but only the kind of free-to-air TV, which included I Dream of Jeannie and Mr. Bean, neither of which I ever want to see again in my life. Well, I was released along with 3 other foreigners who were being held on the 17th of November 2022, so after about 3 months, and immediately deported back to the UK.
And you touched on this. I mean, did it reveal anything sort of culturally that was it an opportunity to sort of connect with an element of Myanmar culture? Because obviously your husband's experiences illustrate for large sections, imprisonment seems to be somewhat of a rite of passage. And then just more broadly, I mean, regardless of the Burmese specifics of it, do you have a different perspective on prison and incarceration after that experience?
It was a culture which was sort of familiar to me from secondhand tales, but experiencing it in the flesh was obviously different. And the thing that most struck me was the boredom of it. You do time, and that really is what you think about the whole time. It's, what am I going to do tomorrow? Nothing. And I'm someone who's always been used to checking my Outlook calendar to think, oh my God, how am I going to manage 10 appointments? Suddenly there was nothing. Every day rolled out the same way. So therefore you slow down, you look after your health above all. I mean, the prison greeting seems, whereas when you're outside, the greeting in Myanmar is often, have you eaten yet? Or have you had lunch? Whereas in the jails, it seemed to be mainly look after your health. And so that's what, I concentrated on. I came out healthier than I was when I went in because I had so much time to exercise and just to relax and to try to meditate. And that really was what a lot of prisoners do. But boredom and the separation from families, I think, is really tough. I mean, I am lucky that I had both very good treatment by the standards of a prison. I mean, clearly I was in the kind of the VIP celebrity prisoners area, as was my husband. And I was able to see him every couple of weeks for 20 minutes. So we were lucky because many people who were separated from their families and their families were outside haven't had contact with their families for maybe 3 years or more because of COVID and security situation. So at least that's the reason that the prison authorities have given for not allowing family visits. I was in a much better situation than many prisoners in there, but that nonetheless didn't speed the time anymore. I was just very lucky that time was only 3 months. And I constantly wish that my fellow prisoners from my cell block, who I got to know very well, will be released as well, like me. There is a huge human resources talent inside that jail. I mean, my cell block prisoners, a couple of sort of celebrities, the woman who'd headed Yangon City Council, and then in my husband's cell block, there was a leading pediatric neurologist, actors, writers, journalists, and so on. I mean, all of these people are people who should be outside serving society, not locked up. So I guess that's made me think about incarceration, but I think very different incarceration in the UK or the US or elsewhere. I mean, sometimes I used to be happy that I was inside a Myanmar jail rather than the UK or US one, because there I think the prison community are prisoners who have real problems, who have psychological, criminal problems, aggression, those kind of things. Whereas most of the prisoners you meet inside insane are the good guys. It's the bad guys who are outside.
Yeah, very true. Although this latest chapter of your career has certainly been dramatic and highlights the darker elements of the Myanmar experience, because there's obviously sort of, since the military takeover, there's been the consistent theme of political kind of repression in one way, shape, or form. Perhaps we should just sort of shift to look at what has drawn you consistently to this country that you obviously clearly love. Since you've had to leave Myanmar and the timing of your return is uncertain, what do you miss most about Myanmar? What are the most noteworthy elements of Myanmar culture that sort of you would want to sort of convey to somebody who's never been there?
The beauty of the country and its variety, including its environmental beauty. I mean, some of that is under pressure, but it is still much more raw and natural than you'll find in most parts of that region nowadays. And likewise, its culture is still much more original than, again, in the region or here. You know, the sort of the Coca-Colanization, although it was a little bit getting hold, really hasn't impacted on most Myanmar villages. So you do feel like you're stepping back in time. And yeah, I mean, I miss all of that, and family and friends. It is, though, a really traumatized country at the moment, and obviously I see and talk on a daily basis to people who are coming in and out. And what you hear is this sort of atmosphere of mistrust, of division, of polarization, of anger on all sides. And I think that those are things which were not there when I went in 1990. In 1990, it was more the sort of suppressed fear and frustration. But now there's a greater sense of aggression and mistrust, and a lack of community, which I hope will be a temporary thing, and I hope will be resolved. As obviously I hope the whole of Myanmar's political problems will be resolved. Right now, it is a very bleak time for everyone.
I guess just sort of before we leave Myanmar in terms of this conversation, sort of, I guess, thinking back to sort of happier times for the country, I mean, what would have been sort of a few things that you would have done in sort of a day off that would have been sort of, from your perspective, would be how you would have sort of connected with sort of the country and your sort of your experiences there?
The area that I've come to love in Myanmar is southern Shan State. We bought a house in Kalor in 2018, which served as a sort of bolt hole during COVID and then during the coup. And Kalor is a hill station in the pine woods up in the mountains, so it's relatively cool. It has fabulous vegetables, so I would go to the market, buy wild mushrooms and tomatoes and avocados. I mean, everything coming out of your ears, and incredibly cheap by international standards. Burmese food, particularly the things which are good, are things like the salads, what's called a thot, which are sort of salads mixed by hand, which you as a foreigner often don't eat because everyone says, don't touch the salads, but actually it's one of the best parts of Burmese cuisine. So avocado salad, pickled tea salad, tomato salad. And then traveling around that area, which is a bit like Tuscany, it's sort of rolling hills and red earth and a lot of nature. There are people who will take you out to look for orchids, but leaving on the tree, of course. Or there are pagodas up at the top of hills that you can walk up to. So there's so much that one can do there. I mean, it has so much potential, and it was a potential that was being developed for tourism. I think it would be a fabulous place for regional trips, weekend trips in future, but obviously not in the current situation where the security and political crisis is such as it is. So spending time going around southern Shan states, I can never get enough of that.
Well, it definitely sounds idyllic. And then talking about another idyllic place that you spent some time, Chicago. Mm-hmm. We'd be remiss not to circle back to the beginning and your days at University of Chicago. So as you sort of indicated, you'd come from a UK university setting. You'd sort of just graduated Cambridge, I believe, and you'd sort of deferred the Foreign Office for a year. What were your impressions of the U of C back then and Chicago generally?
So I arrived in September 1987, and I stayed the year in International House. I was taking a mixture of undergraduate courses. So I learned Portuguese. I did what was called Taco Civ, Introduction to Latin American Civilization. I did international relations, and then a few sort of mixtures of development courses. But I also did a lot of work within the program office of iHouse, organising some of the trips and excursions. And it was at the time of the run up to the 1988 presidential election. We had caucuses. We sort of celebrated the Iowa caucus by having a hustings in iHouse with all of the different representatives of the Democratic and Republican contenders. And then I ran a sort of mock election by getting, I think it was a spinach box from the canteen and turning that into a ballot box. And I always have this memory of an Indonesian grad student saying to me, "Oh, no, I can't vote here or I'll lose my citizenship," which told me a lot about elections in other countries if they honestly thought that they were run in spinach boxes. Anyway, so that was great fun to get sort of embedded in American politics. And I spent a lot of time in the coffee shop in the ground floor of the Divinity School. It was just called the Swift Cottage, a Swift Cafe then because it's Swift Building, but I now see it's called the Grounds of Being. So I met a bunch of people there who I've stayed in touch with, and then got out into Chicago to a few blues concerts, and perhaps most memorably saw Tom Waits, which was fabulous.
Oh yeah, that's fantastic. Yeah, and that was when sort of I mean, he's always been sort of a bit underground, but that was probably I think when he was.
It was all chimney orange and whatever. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and in terms of kind of from a comparative perspective, I mean, how did Chicago sort of differ? What were your impressions of sort of the American educational approach at the university level versus the UK, just in terms of kind of differences or similarities?
It was a bit difficult to say because I made a transfer from doing a science degree to doing social sciences.
Right, okay.
And because I was moving into a completely different subject area. So I was sort of approaching it as an undergraduate again. There was a lot more, felt, going to classes, that kind of thing. In Cambridge, you can get away without going to any lectures at all. I think that would be difficult in Chicago. All of this, though, is a very, very long time away. And obviously some of the sort of physical similarities of U of C campus, it's trying to be an Oxford or a Cambridge college. So that was nice to be around. I loved it. And I loved Chicago and iHouse as well. I had a fabulous year.
And yeah, I guess similar to sort of the last question on Myanmar, what would the perfect day in late 1980 Chicago include? And what would you be listening to on your Walkman?
It depends on the weather. Are we talking, well, of course, whether it was winter or summer, you couldn't necessarily tell from day to day. There was a record shop I was buying stuff from on, was it 57th Street, I think. And as far as I remember, right, yeah. I was listening to Sting, and I went to see the Smiths playing somewhere up on the north side as well. So
yeah, well, I mean, Chicago obviously, sort of over the decades, has become very well known as sort of a culinary capital. I think probably
it was
that sort of predates that a bit. I would think.
It does predate that, I think. I remember eating a lot of pizza and having my first Japanese meal ever somewhere up on 55th Street with a guy called Z. Benisa, who I'm still in contact with.
Oh, well, brilliant. Well, I guess on that note, obviously, it's sort of, you've had a fascinating career since then, and obviously it's fantastic that sort of Chicago played a small role in that and setting you on a range of fascinating international experiences. And I would just like to thank you so much for taking the time out, and I've thoroughly enjoyed the conversation, and I know others will as well.
Thank you very much, Dominic. Thanks. Nice to talk to you.